Hey, girl. All right. Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is the Sunday garden question and answer video that I do on Sundays. You can ask questions down below this video, and I pick from those each week. Getting a ton of questions right now. Obviously, going into spring, people have lots and lots of questions. And so, again, I'm trying to pick through ones that I haven't necessarily answered or not answered in one of these Q&As. I may have answered it in a separate video, but I try to get them into these Q&As. A few just channel updates before I get started on that. I have a stone project. The video went up on Friday from Jeremy and Megan's house. A big giant stone project going in with boulders the size of, 3,500 pound boulders. I think there's like 5 of those. And it's a lot of stone and a lot of materials going into that project. We'll be following along as he puts that project in. It's kind of a follow-up to my time over at Juniper Level Botanic Garden with Tony Avent, and you saw all the stone in the background. Anytime we stopped and talked about a plant, there's stone everywhere, and Jeremy had done a lot of that work. So that should be interesting, hopefully, to follow along with. And then I shot a rain garden video over the course of about a week and a half. Rain garden going in. I just got to get it edited and up. You guys should hopefully see that on Monday after watching this, maybe Tuesday. I've got to get one more piece of video up there where they've sodded the backyard now, so it's kind of a finished product. I haven't done that, but should have that on that video. And I'm just trying to show the purpose of a rain garden. And then yesterday I had a meeting down in the Sandhills at the Weymouth Center. It's the home of James Boyd, and his wife built this house like 100 years ago, and it's you guys will learn all about the house and everything. I put up a post on YouTube, a photo on YouTube of the front of the house, and that's a project where I'm going to be redoing the foundation plantings. It's not going to be a lot of different types of plants, but it should be interesting. Just the history of the house, and then the plantings, and they have a lot of deer issues, and so that's one issue we're tackling with the planting. So anyway, hopefully that turns out to be an interesting project. That's probably a month away in the process, but I had the meeting yesterday, and they're starting to prep for the actual job. Okay, we'll move on to some questions. Somebody asked when they could move Echinacea and Veronica. You can do that in the early spring or the early fall. So either one of those times. I wouldn't do it in the peak summer. And then, of course, it's just difficult to do it in the winter because you don't even know where to dig. So, but now would be fine. You don't have to wait until after the frost-free date to move those things. They're plenty cold hardy. If they started to peak up a bit and you could see them, you can go ahead and move them. Somebody said they have purple foliage on their tulips that are coming up, and they're in zone 8A. And it makes me wonder if you have a phosphorus deficiency. I don't know if these were tulips that were coming back from last year or ones you purchased, but typically it's kind of hard to say, because if they were newly planted tulips, they should have had everything they needed within that tulip bulb, and so deficiencies wouldn't occur until the following year, of it trying to rebuild energy in the bulb. But I want to call that a phosphorus deficiency because typically we see that purple color. You'll see that in tomatoes as well. If you don't get your tomatoes in the ground in a reasonable amount of time, we'll see phosphorus deficiencies. Potassium deficiencies too can show up as a little bit of purple coloration, but I want to call it a phosphorus deficiency. Don't know what area you live in, or how long those tulips have been in the ground, but typically that creates a purple foliage where it shouldn't be. Let's see. Oh, okay. Somebody bought a Salvia Numerosa variety. It's a lower Salvia Nimorosa. There's a lot of different varieties, but that one tends to have lower foliage and spiky flowers. Most Nimorosas don't bloom heavily for me in the middle summer. They tend to bloom in slightly cooler areas, similar to the Greggii. Then the ones that are more hardy, like 8 to 11, tend to bloom in the peak summer down here in our heat. But anyway, Salvia Numerosa that's in full flower and it's floppy. You can prune the flowers back on it if you want to, because they will reflower. But I would just leave it be. This is one they just bought, and so I wouldn't have. I'm more concerned that you bought it in full flower in March and put it in the ground in zone 7A. it shouldn't have been in full. It came out of a greenhouse, obviously, because that would not be. They'd be barely peaking. My Nimorosa, I have a couple Salvia Numerosa varieties out on the road out here, and they're barely peaking up. You know what I mean? I can see where they are, but they're definitely not in flower, and they won't be until late April probably. So I'm more concerned with that you need to protect them between now and the end of your average, your frost-free time. So somebody asked me about covering their tomatoes if it gets under 50 degrees and they're in zone 8B in Texas. I would think even in zone 8B, it would have been a little early to have your tomatoes in the ground at this point. But yeah, I've got my seedlings for my tomatoes are inside, and I'm going to bring them out in the next few days because they are up and ready to get some sunlight on them. I'll talk more about seedlings toward the end of this video, but definitely anything under 50, I'd rather not have, definitely anything under 45, I'm probably going to bring tomatoes in. I mean, they're truly tropical plants. They're actually perennials. They'll get woody, but here we obviously use them as annuals for one season, and then the frost in the fall gets them, or some disease or whatever gets them during the summertime. But anything below 45 can stunt them, and it could cause some of those deficiencies to appear. If you don't have a healthy, vigorous root system underneath them, then they can't bring up phosphorus or potassium or something like that. And you'll see some weird off colorations in tomatoes where it's above freezing, but it's below where they're actually comfortable. You'll see some of those issues. So yeah, anything under 45, I'm bringing them in for sure, and I'd probably would rather not have anything under 50 on them. Let's see. Pollinator Garden in a bed near the road. Okay, oh yeah, I got a question about somebody wanted to know if they should have a pollinator garden in a bed near the road because they were worried about the pollution or whatever. My pollinator garden is literally from the back line of the property to the front line of the property. I wouldn't worry about that at all, unless I live next to like a highway and, maybe, I didn't want butterflies sucked into it, but if you live on a slow street, I put stuff right out to the road. Heck yeah. Holly decided to come around to this side. Somebody asked me my compost to pine bark ratio in containers. I said this year I'm going to use compost in my containers. I'm going to mix a little bit of pine bark in there for drainage. Got to be careful with this because if you put too much pine bark in it, it will drain too well. And then by the middle of the season, you're going to be watering like crazy. So there's this delicate balance of using materials early on, like compost, that stay too wet. So, when you first plant something, I kind of want a material that can hold a lot of water, and then I'm super careful about not overwatering it early in the season, so that later in the season, I'm not having to, water 3 times a day to keep it watered. So I'm not using more than about 25 or maybe 30% pine bark in that compost, and which also means it's kind of heavy too, because the compost is heavier than the bark. But I want to lean toward more moisture in the container, but being super careful not to overwater initially. Once something's rooted into the container, the rest of the season, if I use too much pine bark, I'm just be watering like crazy. There you go. Hopefully that makes sense. Somebody asked me for something narrow they can plant in the full sun in Texas. Podocarpus is something that I would definitely lean on. Something like Pringles Podocarpus, which is a dwarf one that stays narrow. I think they were just looking for something narrow between a driveway, but I do like Podocarpus for that. If you go over to Charleston, South Carolina, it seems like every yard is lined with Podocarpus, which is kind of funny, but they do lend themselves to being kept on the narrower side. Let's see. Somebody asked about underplanting a crabapple that has lots of roots, and I've talked about using that root slayer shovel, if you do have root issues. But the other thing is buying smaller containers. You don't have to, hopefully you can locate things when I'm underplanting areas that I know are heavy in roots or just more difficult to dig in. I like to buy 1-gallon containers. My nursery for a long time was actually specialized in growing trade gallon or 3-quart containers for other nurseries. And so that was 90% of what I did. And then I had a spot at the farmer's market where I sold 1-gallon container shrubs and perennials. And I had a giant audience for those things because there's a lot of people who just simply can't physically dig large holes, or they have places that they can't dig large holes. So, there is a huge demand out there for 1 gallon material. And I don't mind waiting and watching something to grow. So if you can find things in smaller containers, it certainly makes those efforts easier. Somebody asked about assessing plant health from plants that they overwintered, meaning, obviously the top of the plants, you can visually see what's going on there, but you can flip a container over, and as it's warming up like it is right now, I would expect anything out here in a container to have some new white roots on them. So, you can pull at the roots around the edge of it. You can flip the container upside down, pull the pot off, and then if all the roots are just kind of brown and kind of liquidy, that's root rot. I would expect some of that overwintering some things in a container, but you should see some new white roots on them by now, especially with the warm days we're having and growing these plants in black pots. But that's one way to assess their health, is just to see if they're putting on new root growth, they're probably in good shape. Let's see. Somebody asked if some of the nurseries I show are still using neonics or neonicotinoids. This group of insecticides that are nicotine-based insecticides that have been linked to honeybee deaths and honeybee hives collapsing. That's a question that I actually don't know the answer to. I've been removed from the nursery business a bit too long. I know that like over at Plant Delights, that place is mostly all organic. I don't know, where others are. We have to spray in the nursery business. There's no way you can't. It's a completely unnatural event to line 5,000 of the same thing up next to one another and try to see how fast you can make them grow. It's completely unnatural, and it gets attacked by a lot of different things. But I would imagine that most of the nurserymen have put them to the side at this point. But unfortunately, I just can't speak for all of them. It might be something where, the states end up requiring some labeling or something like that. I don't know. Battery died. Somebody had a pear that got fire blight, and they're removing it. Wanted to know if they could plant a red bud in its place. The red bud, it's unlikely that the red bud, most of the time these plants don't share the same diseases. So, fire blight's tough on pears and apples and some other things, but not necessarily red buds. They have their own bacterial wilt that they get. So doesn't mean it can't get something, but unlikely that it would get that. And keep in mind, what you're seeing most of the time when you see a disease problem or an insect problem going after a plant is you're seeing a plant that's in a weakened condition. So, think of it that way. The insects and the diseases aren't out to get you. They're out to destroy, they're able to destroy weak plants and remove them so, others don't, that plant's no longer able to produce seed and continue its life. It's just kind of the plan nature has for everything. When it goes into a weakened state, it pretty quickly succumbs to something. So if you tell me all the dogwoods are dying in an area from some particular issue, in all likelihood, those dogwoods are weakened. Either it's hotter in that area or drier in that area or wetter in that area, or, something has taken place that allowed that disease, an opportunistic, disease to set in and remove them rather quickly. So, just keep that in mind. Something was likely wrong with the pear. I don't know what that is, but, that allowed it to succumb to that issue. So even if a healthy plant shouldn't end up with the same problems, typically. It's not always. Somebody asked me about tips on growing lamb's ear, and I mentioned this in a tour video. I don't think I've mentioned it in a Q&A. I couldn't remember if I had or not. But lamb's ear likes soils that are kind of lean, and so the best lamb's ear I see growing in the neighborhood or out by the road in kind of unmaintained spaces, and it can get quite aggressive. It's one of those plants that you can go from you go from killing it to it can take over some space pretty quickly. To keep that in mind. But I talked about a lot of the prairie plants like echinaceas and black-eyed Susans and other grasses kind of liking it lean as well. Lamb's ear goes into that group of plants that don't go crazy with the compost and the fertilizer and the mulch. Plant the things in the ground and then cover the soil up to them with a small amount of mulch and leave them be. And they should be fine. Let's see. Somebody asked for an update on my Burning Love Leucothoi. Here's a little video snippet of it. It still is in great shape out in the front garden space. And then another person asked for an update on my Beijing Beauty Mahonia, which is directly behind here. And there's a little video on it. It looks phenomenal. This Beijing Beauty Mahonia is absolutely one of my favorite plants in the landscape, and I did not think I'd be calling a Mahonia. Not that I dislike Mahonia. I like lots of Mahonias. Some are a bit too seedy, obviously, but and are invasive, but others aren't. The ones that aren't are great plants, but this one in particular, I really like its compact habit. Then somebody asked about seedling spacing. I'll typically put 2 or 3 seeds, in a cell pack. That was another question somebody got about why there's so many seeds in some of these seed packs. It's only true with ones that are super, super easy. So if you buy a pack of basil produces massive amounts of seed. So if they're selling a 1/4 ounce or 1/2 ounce of it or whatever, it ends up just being, the seed is inexpensive to collect and give you. My F1 hybrid tomatoes, on the other hand, you get like 15 or 10 seeds sometimes, for the same price. So it really is up to how easy it is to collect that seed as to how big the packs are. But yes, generally speaking, 100 seeds is more than most people need for whatever they're doing, or 200 or 500 or whatever. What question was I actually on? Seedling spacing. So if you put 2 or 3 seeds in an individual spot, I do like to thin those down to 1 typically, because I don't want the plants taking up the same exact root space. But I do plant things closer in the landscape than what people recommend. So if the tag says it's plant them 6 to 8 inches apart, I'm probably planting them 4 to 6 inches apart. But my individual plants are just in fact 1 individual plant and not 2 or 3 clustered together, because those are occupying the same exact square footage and can potentially compete with one another poorly. So I want individual plants, thin them down to individual plants, but then when you plant them in the landscape, I do typically go a little closer, but my soil's highly amended. If your soil's not highly amended, you may need a little more space between them. Let's see. Mine can root down deep as well as out. That's the point with that. What are the best annuals I have to attract pollinators? I'm definitely going to say the Kufia is right at the top of the list. And then any annual salvia that you can find. I talked about Salvia Numerosa earlier. That's a perennial one, but literally any salvia that you can find, whether it be annual or perennial, are going to get the hummingbirds and the bees into your landscape. And don't forget about, I've got a red bud behind the camera back here that's in full flower. It's actually starting to leaf out. It's past full peak flower. And the native bees love the native flowering trees. And so don't take trees off your list, for the pollinators. And then of course, winter flowering shrubs. But annual wise, I would definitely say Kufia and my Summer Jewels Salvia, 2 of the least floriferous things in this yard. I mean, they get lots and lots of flowers, but from a distance, they're not as showy to us. So I'm willing to sacrifice some of my space for the, not big giant flowers for me, but little teeny tiny flowers for the pollinators. So those are my best 2 for the pollinators, are probably 2 of my least for the humans that are coming into the backyard, except for you get to enjoy, the pollinators that are coming to those plants. Let's see. Somebody asked about starting seed in a bright window versus on a light rack, and they had success just in a bright window. Yeah, absolutely. If you got a bright enough window in your house, there's no reason why you can't start seed. Be careful transitioning those seeds to the outdoor space, which was another question I got about them wilting when you put them out in full sun. My seedlings that are on the light rack in there are getting brighter light than yours in the window. They still germinate fine and come up fine, but yours are less adapted to this direct sun than mine are on those super bright lights. And so when I take mine off the light rack, I can go directly out into the full sun. You need to be careful going from slightly lower light to absolute full sun. You might want to put them out for an hour or so, or put them in dappled sunlight and then move them out into the sunlight over a few days. So keep that in mind. At the end of the day, that's one of the only real differences, is, you know, you have to be more cautious taking them directly out into the full sun. And then that was another question I got, was seedlings wilting when they're going out into the full sun. Yes, they will wilt if they haven't gotten adequate light, and then, of course, then your tendency is to think that they need water. But don't water them unless the tray is actually dry. So, you know, fill the individual cells, or if you have them planted all in one big pot, just fill them individually. Make sure they're actually dry before you water them. If you're taking them out into the sun and they're wilting and they're still moist, get them out of the sun. Get them back into a place that's more dappled light for a day or two, and then ease them back out into the sun over 2 or 3 days. But that's what's happening there. They just didn't get enough light, and now it's just the same thing as your skin in the wintertime. You know, you go to the beach the first day, and you know, the end of May, and you know, you're going to burn because your skin hasn't seen the sunlight. Let's see. And then over winter, I got a lot of questions this time of year about overwatering issues on seedlings. And yeah, you got to be, I mean, that's the biggest thing. Keep in mind, germinating a seed, as fun as it is, isn't the actual skill. I mean, that was done by when a bee pollinated a flower, or a fly or a hummingbird or something like that pollinated a flower last year, you know, and then that plant formed that seed. All the work was done there. So if you put a seed somewhere, it's going to germinate, because that's what they do if they're given the right conditions. So as rewarding as that isn't the actual hard part. It's getting that seedling up to a transplantable size, and 90% of them that die are going to be overwatered. You know, that's for sure. So, you know, that's something that's somewhat trust issue. So if you're a new gardener, you tend to think that you just got to be overly involved. And I've been doing this long enough, and a lot of people watching right now have been doing this long enough to know that if a few cells in the tray are slightly dry, to just leave it be. And you know, and give it another few hours or another half a day or a day before you actually water that tray. Because if you water for the 5 or 10 driest cells in the tray, you're going to overwater the remaining 30 or 35 that didn't need water. So you know, it's that type of you'll be less prone to overwater the more you do it. Because then at some point, you know, as a kid, you know, your grandparents knew they put their seed out in the garden, they walked away, and if, you know, in their mind it got watered or it didn't get watered, and it got fed if it got, you know what I mean? Like they had that life experience with it that a lot of folks don't have now. And so when folks jump in now, they jump in with both feet, and they go, I got to water it, I got to fertilize it, I got to do this, I got to do this, what can I spray, what can I do this, what can I do that? And end up loving things to death and just kind of overdoing things. Going back even to that lamb's ear, you know, you buy a $10, $12 lamb's ear, and you go, you know, I'm going to give it the best hole in the world. It's going to be you know, I'm going to buy a $10 bag of this and a $5 bag of that. And, you know, the next thing you know, it's drowning because it's a plant that actually just wanted to be planted in the ground and left alone. So that happens a lot. But I think you'll, like I say, take a step back, you know, when you're thinking about watering something, and, you know, analyze the whole tray and not that one individual wilting plant or that one individual, you know, in the group. That's my best advice on it. And experience will change your overwatering. Trust me. And then you'll end up with so many things at some point that a lot of things get, you know, you'll expertly ignore lots of things. So again, you guys can ask questions down below, and I'll pick from those for next week's video. Haven't slept in a couple days, so I hope I wasn't too mumbly in this one. Thanks for watching.